Good morning, Beis, Volume 2. We're at the top of page 1165. Aleph Kuf Samachay. Okay, so we reviewed yesterday more in depth, more elaborately, the parentheses about the role of Chochmah, Seichel in general and Chochmah in particular, in context of the Nefesh. So the Nefesh, the Etzema Nefesh, is Pashut, higher than any definition. It manifests and expresses itself through the faculties. In the faculties itself, Chochmah, the first of the 10 faculties, is the Reish, she calls it, the head. Essentially the first landing spot of the Nefesh's residence, where it dwells, and from there it extends to all the other faculties. Like we discussed, the central nervous system, the brain, the mind. Now, the parentheses, just to quickly sum up, elaborated on this relationship, because on one hand, the nefesh is higher than the faculties. On the other hand, the faculties are an expression of the nefesh, and especially Chochmah, to the point that Chochmah techaye ba'aleha, that Chochmah invigorates its owner, so to speak, its nefesh, because they explained in Aveda, because the nefesh can be in golus and shivya, in exile and captivity, and therefore it's not expressed. On the other hand, the faculties are in our control. Meiche b'reshusei, as he brought from Perek Yud Zayin and Tanya, which means, and you can contemplate, v'yizbeinin, the lashon he used was, the exact lashon, Meiche b'reshusei, v'yochel yizbeinei b'chol, kichol asher yachpeitz. And that's in our control. So even when the Etzema Nefesh, which is Ba'aleha, is concealed, in a state of concealment, golus, nevertheless, the faculties, you can access them, you can generate power from them, and that can cause, as he explains there in Tanya, even every person easily, it doesn't cause a revealed love and emotional reaction, but at least in your mind, you can appreciate what God is about, and therefore there's some stimulation. So that's the Chochmah Techaye Ba'aleha. So we see that the relationship between the Nefesh and Chochmah, and the rest, of course, through Chochmah to the other faculties, is not just that this is beyond and manifests in Chochmah, but Chochmah actually does something in return for the Nefesh. Okay. And of course, we explained the last line, Kechel Asher Yachpeitz, which the Rebbe Rashabik said, and I said, we're still not clear what's the difference in Rotzen Hanelem, Egam Chetzenis HaRotzen. So I'm still doing research on that. I'm not sure. I did find, just in case any of you want to look up, there's a letter from the Rebbe in volume 1 of Igros Kodesh, where he talks about different levels of Rusa Deliba and speaks about this chapter 17. But I've not been able to derive from there with more clarity on this page here. But he does talk about that it's definitely a Rotzen that is awakened not through this, not the natural atzmizdika desire to be connected to Elokus. The Rebbe says it clearly. I'm reading in Igros Kodesh. It just reinforces what I already said, but it's pretty clear on its own. So in case you do want to look it up, it's on page, let me see where it is. Here we are. The letter, it's a long letter. It starts on page 3, Shin Yud Gimel in Igros Kodesh of the Rebbe, volume 1. It's a letter from Tafshin Daled, 1944. And on page, what he says there is like this, just to reinforce a certain point that he says in Perek Yud Zayin. I want to read one line to you. He says, okay, on page 318 in the letter, he says the following. The one who wrote to the Rebbe, Shalom Rifkin, wrote to the Rebbe, he wanted to know what does it mean in Tanya, Perek Mem Daled, Perek Lamed Tes, he calls Rusa Delib and he says canal. with what is the canal referring to. And the Rebbe says it's referring to chapter 17 in Tanya, the one we're reviewing here, that we're involved with. And he says like this, that in Perek Mem Daled, he talks about Ava Hativus, about the natural love to God. And there, Moichin, intellect, only can reveal it, but it doesn't create it. But in Perek Lametes, and also in chapter 17, he says, Ha'ava ha'neiledes mehizbonenus, min ha'izbonenus, v'loi ba'ava mesoteres shebeteva kol Yisrael. The Rebbe's words. So exactly like we learned, because the question in Tanya is, chapter 17, how could you say Karev Elecha Adover Ma'id, when the fact is we see tangibly that it's not easy to awaken a love to God. So he says, but it's easy to contemplate. Because you're not talking about the natural love. You're talking about contemplating, and that contemplation gives birth to some type of concealed emotion. He calls it talumas libe, concealed, but something. Okay. So you can look it up yourself there. Now, at the end of this parentheses and summing up, he says,
you said
so therefore,
page
when we have the seichel and the koach HaSeichel, the koach HaSeichel therefore does have the ability that's in our control, where Ratzon is not, because Ratzon is, it's like I said, you're hardwired. Either you have it or you don't have it. And then he says, through that capacity of contemplating, you mechaye ba'aleh, because it reawakens even in Golus, even when that etzem hanefesh pnimius halev is not revealed, it touches it. So firstly, you excite, you stimulate the guf nefesh abamis, he says. It should bittul and should not conceal. So then, once you have achieved some level of avodah, even if it's on a low level, let's make it very clear, it's the lowest possible level. Nevertheless, you now, since you're already engaged, so in some way, it also stimulates, it doesn't go into detail, but you see that it can bring back the isgalus of the nefesh, which is the hardwiring of the love that is inherently inside of a person. So basically, as I explained, behavioral love that comes through contemplation can in turn stimulate and awaken the inherent love that may be completely concealed. And that's how the Rebbe Rashab explains Ageres HaKedesh Siman Daled based on Perek Yud Zayin in Tanya. But then to conclude the point, so though Seichel has that ability to Chaye Ba'alel, and then he continues that it also has the ability to bring the nefesh down in a low level through Chachmas Chitzenius, but Kol Mokim, nevertheless, it's not Atzmus HaNefesh. So it relates, the nefesh resides, dwells in Chachma. Chachma in turn also has an effect on the nefesh. But B'Poel Mamash, he says, that's because the nefesh manifests and encloses itself in Chachma and is united with it. But fundamentally, it's still a Koach HaNefesh. That's where we're up to. It's 6 lines from the top of page 1165. And I'm going to continue inside. Someone wants to ask something? Okay. So we continue here. Now he goes on. This was a long parenthesis that began. So this parenthesis spanned 2/3 of the page 1164, all the way to the top here. So just to go back to the parentheses to see the flow, what did we say before the parentheses? I'm reading on page 1164 before the parentheses. He said that HaChochma mispashit ma'nefesh kachal there's a koach haseichel shemesh hodak keli lemuchus va'atzmus hanefesh. So what we've established it, on one hand, it's a keli, but on the other hand, it's not atzmus hanefesh, which is coming to explain the levushim of Atzilus. The koach hanefesh was coming to explain what's the difference between a levush hanifred and a levush atzmi. They're both garments, but one is a garment minei ubei, as we'll discuss now, and one is a garment that's separate. This is all coming to explain that Atzilus has in it two dimensions. One is its divine element, and the other is its structural element that relates to existence. And explaining that, the difference between Etzem HaNefesh and Koach HaNefesh. So right away, Koach is not the Etzem, but it's still an expression of the Etzem. Keep that in mind. And now he's going to continue here. V'haraya. And the proof for this, the proof for what? That it's not the Etzem HaNefesh, but it's a keli for the Etzem HaNefesh. For Muhuz v'atzmus HaNefesh, I should say. Muhuz not Etzem HaNefesh, Muhuz v'atzmus HaNefesh. He says, V'haraya, the proof of this, Shahare, HaSeichel yesh bei shinuyim, the katnus v'gadlus. We see that Seichel is subject to changes. There's changes as we grow and mature. Katnus HaMeichin is when a person is younger and less mature, the mind is less developed. And Gadlus is as it develops more. The cotton, Sichle Bekatnus, a young person, a child, his Seichel is Bekatnus. He has a mind, he has a brain and a mind, but his mind is still in a diminished state, not fully developed. Ukeshenigdal, Sichlem is Gadol. And as he matures or as he gets older, his Seichel expands. That's obvious, that's a fact. So you see that Seichel is Shinuyim. In the level of development of a person's mind, there's changes. So you could argue that though this is due to the container, who says it's the Seichel itself? The person who's born with Seichel, he just doesn't have a container to express it all. So he says, Agam Shazal Mitzad HaKeli, the Sibas Katnus HaSeichel Gabe Kotten. The reason that the Seichel is in a diminished state, or in a less mature, a more immature state, by a child, who Mitzad Katnus HaKli, or Katnus HaKeli, it's due to the small container. His mind is not expanded. It's just like saying someone has, let's say, unbelievable muscles. And when they grow older, you see they're really powerful, physically. That same person, you look when they were 5 years old, you're not going to see all that strength. So what changed? Not the strength changed. The keli wasn't there yet. The muscles didn't physically develop. The kelim were not there. So he says, even though, therefore, it's because of the keli, so to speak, nevertheless, one second, let me continue. He still didn't finish the Hagam. The Koach HaSeichel yesh bei gam bei yesei kotten. Because the power of intelligence he has even when he's a child. And furthermore, the gam nikar lepamim, and at times, it's nikar, it's obvious or discernible. At times, bekotten milas sichle. So not only is it the keli, more than that, the child, sometimes you see the quality of his intelligence. Then butzim mekat v'yedi. I don't know if he brings that here. Yeah, he does. The next line. That you could see, for example, the stories with the Rabbeim or other great minds, when they were young, you could sense there was a higher state of intelligence, not developed yet fully. So he's saying that even though we just said Seichel HaShinuyim, even though you could say the Shinuyim are due to the Keli, to the maturity of the container, and to the point you even see in the cotton, Maila Sichle, Ukumay Tinuk Charif, like a sharp child, a sharp-minded child. Shenikar Bay, that we can recognize in him, Sheyesh Bay Charifas Besichle, that he has a sharpness in his mind, Ukumay Butzin, Mikatve Yediyah. This is a Gemara that says, Butzin, even when they're young, you can sense a deeper intelligence. I looked it up. The actual translation means, I'm trying to remember the context in the Gemara. I have to look it up again. But bottom line is that you can recognize in the young age.
It's something that is growing, and right away when you are cutting it off, you could see that it's a better type of a.
Right. Yeah. I think you're correct. It's something about some growth, but I want to look it up explicitly, specifically. But it's used often on this expression that even in the young age, even though it's not fully there, you can already recognize, like he says, the sharpness of the mind. And it's only due to the fact that the container of the intelligence by the child are small, like physically, a smaller brain, a smaller mind. So in other words, he's explaining both sides. On one hand, he's still a child. Even the people that you can tell that there's something there, you still, the charifus, you're not going to see in deep abstract ideas necessarily. It's nevertheless, because the kelim are small, that's why it expresses itself, the seichel, is in bekatnus, in small matters, in bekatnus in a diminished way, ubedvarim tani, and small matters. Umukol mokim. So this is Hagam. So he started saying that Raya is bringing a proof here. This is all part of a proof that seichel is not etzem hanefesh. It's only a keli for it. So he's building this. So far, we've said the following, 2 points so far. Number one, it goes through changes from a child to an adult in the level of the growth of the mind. V'hagam, and though that's due to the keli, to the point that you can even recognize in a young child, at times you can recognize a higher intelligence. But it's only due to the keli that it doesn't fully manifest. In a way, it's still in a childish fashion. But he says, but then now he's finishing that phrase, that Hagam. And he says like this, and nevertheless, even though we just said it's due to the kelim, so he's saying, this itself, that the keli can affect the oir. Because l'chayri, you could say, 1 second, if the mind is very powerful, if you have a lot of electricity, who cares if the keli is small? The electricity is there. The fact that the keli can impact, the fact that the kelim have not been developed, the immaturity of the containers is still smaller, and that impact that the seichel is not developed, that itself, he says, tells you, that according to the change in the container, meaning its growth, its smaller container to a larger container, that controls and that affects the change in the oir of the seichel, in other words, how much seichel will be expressed, that itself tells you, that itself indicates, is an indicator, that the seichel is not atzmis hanefesh. Because atzmis hanefesh is not affected by kelim. That which is there in the core soul. For example, life itself, the life force. As soon as a child is conceived, as soon as a child is born, it's alive. What will grow will be its giluyim. Its faculties will grow. But a person doesn't become more alive when they're 20 than when they're 1 day old. Again, we're not talking about manifest of life, that the person can run, can fly, can do a lot of stuff. That's expression. But the mere etzem hanefesh, he says, that tells you the seichel itself, even if you're going to, not even, though it's due to the container, but the container impacts the oyer ha-seichel, tells you that's not atzmis hanefesh. Shari etzem bilti mishtana, because the etzem is not subject to change. An etzem does not change. So in other words, if you talk about pure etzem hanefesh chayes ha'odam, from the moment we're born to the moment of after Me'ev Esrim, that does not change. Even if a person is older and they cannot move around as much, and let's put it this way, the nefesh cannot express itself because the kelim are weaker, but the nefesh itself does not change. It's just the kelim don't let it be expressed in that sense. And that I'm giving the example with life force. But if you think about etzem hanefesh, let's say the etzem hanefesh that's connected to godliness, that for sure doesn't change. So I may have to correct what I just said, because you could say chayes hanefesh is similar to seichel. If the kelim are weaker, the nefesh won't be able to express itself. So then you can't say that's called etzem hanefesh. So etzem is built in mishtana, means all the changes that happen in our lives are all in the world of faculties, expression of the nefesh, not in the etzem hanefesh. That's what he's saying here. So raya from seichel, that's even because seichel goes through changes. you have to say that's not reflective of the etzem, which is not subject to change. And we have to find an example of what that etzem is. You can't say it's etzem haseichel, obviously. So it could either be the etzem, like I said, the chai is be'etzem, that person is fundamentally alive, even if they're weak. That you don't say a weak person is God forbid, half dead. They're still a fully live human being. The person who is even an older person who's frail, the person is still an independent life. And as such, you'll see, for example, he's not like, God forbid, after the neshama leaves. So it could be he means that, or he means, let's say I just said, etzem hanefesh, like the etzem hanechelik elakam mal mamish. There's no difference if you're 1 day old or if you're 100 years old. I'm not talking about, again, avoida, an expression of it. The fact that the neshama senasata b'tahirihi, the fact that the yipach ba'ap of nishmas chayim, that element does not subject to change, even though the expression of it can come out more, come out less. Whereas seichel is, okay, good. That's what he's saying here.
I think that even in Gashmias, I don't know what the etzem is, but the etzem is built in Mishtane, not only in the Nefesh Elokis.
I just said that. The life force, the mere fact that you're alive, even if you're weaker or stronger, is an atzmis beginning. Like we spoke about, is there more nefesh, more life in the head than there is in the toe? A person is fully alive. There's more giluyim in the head than in the toe. More expression, more power, and so on. So yeah, you could say something like that. You could say that, yeah.
Why can't you say the same thing on Seichel?
Because what do you mean? Seichel is all about giluyim. What do you mean? Seichel, either you have seichel, you don't have seichel.
Mitzad the Keli, it's changing, like the old man.
But the Keli affects the seichel itself. So that tells you the seichel is bound by that. The nefesh does not change because a person, let's say, is just because let's say a person has an injury. The nefesh, the chayis and nefesh doesn't change. It's only keli. Whereas by comes to seichel, it does change. The seichel itself is not. Remember, seichel is a hamshacha. Seichel is not a atzmi. That's his whole point here. There's a nefesh and there's keiches hanefesh. So the keiches hanefesh are definitely impacted by the keli. And that's why there's subject to change. The neshama, even after Me'ev Esrim Shana, frankly, the neshama does not impact it. It goes back to its place, but seichel absolutely is impacted. There is no more seichel. For all practical purposes, the person is not, his mind isn't working anymore. Because once the nefesh and the guf are separate, or in this case, maturity. So basically, the keches, in this case, seichel, is an expression that's dependent on the keli and it's affected by it, more or less. The nefesh is not. The fact that a person expresses more life does not change the nefesh.
Is a neshama having keiches even without a guf?
L'cheri, yes. Yes, I would say yes. But even the keiches haneshama, let's say in Gan Eden, without a guf, the fact of the matter is, it also has a keli. Just a ruchnisdik keli. In other words, the seichel of the neshama without a guf is still not etzem neshama. It's not atzmus muhus nefesh. That's the point. Because the atzmus nefesh is the core entity that's not defined by its instruments, by its faculties or attributes. Let me put it in the nimshal. He's going to say this about Atzilus. The Eibishter has keiches, correct? Keich chesed, keich gvura. Would you say that's atzmus, muhus? No. You could say it's an expression of his. So chesed and gvura, even in Ruchnis and Atzilus, is subject to change. Because the Eibishter made the Eris and the Kalim speak to each other. But the Etzem, that from where Chesed and Gvura come from, is not subject to change. So the Nimshal in many ways is easier than the Moshel. The same idea here. That the Etzem HaNefesh, or Atzmus Muhus HaNefesh, is not defined by its structure. It manifests in its structure. So you would say the shinuyim that happen are all within the structure, within chesed, gvura, teferes, and so on. Like, for example, let's talk about shchinta begalusa. Okay, the Eibishter is affected that when there was what says by the that when Ayin Tzenish Shalmokim, so the Eibishter has a certain response to that, and we have more Gili Elikus. When Ein Ayin Tzenish Shalmokim, which means when we're not behaving right, there's less Gili Elikus. So let's talk for a moment about that. In the world of Giluyim, there's of course a Shinui Ikri. Here there's Galus Elikus, Beis HaMikdash is standing, Hashras HaShchina. In Galus, there's no Beis HaMikdash, so there's no question there's a Shinui in Gili Elikus in this world. But the Etzem, we know even in Galus, Ani Yeshena V'li Be'er Anas, and also the Eibishter. Even the Elikus that we went into Helam is only the levels of Elikus that are subject to Helam, not to a level of Atzmi that's not subject to Helam. So in that sense, that's the difference between Etzem HaNefesh, Atzmus HaNefesh that he's saying here, and Seichel. Seichel is by definition a faculty. Yes, can you say Etzem Seichel Hiyuli remains intact? Just like, let's say a person, God forbid, has a stroke, or something happens in their mind, some injury, or for that matter, injury in their hand. Of course it doesn't affect the Seichel Hiyuli Atzmi. But you know what? But Seichel is not defined by Seichel Hiyuli Atzmi. Seichel is defined by its expression. Like that Alter Rebbe told that Chassid, just like a ganef is not someone who could steal but steals, a lamdan is not someone who could learn but learns. So Seichel's inyan is to be expressed. The Eibishter didn't make a Seichel Yulia Atzmi as an inyan la'atzmi. It's meant to be the root from which we draw Seichel. A person, as a child, the Seichel begins to develop. The goal is to become an adult and use your mind fully to learn Torah and so on. Now, if God forbid something doesn't allow that, the Seichel is still there. It's true, of course it's there, but it's not function. It's not fulfilling its function. When it comes to the etzem is not defined by function. The etzem is there whether you reveal it or you don't reveal it, because the atzmi is not defined by kelim and by structure. So even though it's true that it may not, the chayis hanefesh may not be expressed because the keli is weak, but the nefesh inyan is not about expression; it's about being. It exists. And then it expresses itself. So in other words, the difference in Seichel and Atzmus HaNefesh is not just in their Gilui. They're fundamentally different. Atzmus HaNefesh is not about Giluyim. Seichel is about Giluyim. Like it is with the Eibishter. That when we say we want to have the Eibishter's chesed, not his gvura, midas ha-chesed or midas ha-teferes, harachamim, not midas ha-din, there you're talking about expression. Obviously, even in midas ha-din, even in the tzimtzum, is really b'shvil hagilui, and there's the levels that the tzimtzum is not kipshut. It does not affect the higher levels of elikus that are b'chlal higher than gilui and helam. Whereas seichel and all the giluyim are subject to gilui and helam. That adds a little explanation to this. Okay.
So you could say that the chayis hamisgale is also not the etzem hanefesh. This is the part is gale to us.
That's why I was questioning myself when I use that example. Like when you say chelik alekam mimal mamish, or ava mesuteres, ava atzmis, rotzen of a neshamet alakus, there it definitely works well. That does not change. Chayis einachanami. But I would say maybe you could say that even if, like, you know, what I said was the equalizer, the chayis hanefesh is equal in the head to the toe, there's somewhat of an aspect. In other words, even if the keli is smaller, you don't say there's less chayis hanefesh in the toe. The toe is not less alive than the head. In its expression, yeah, that's what I was really referring to. So you see there that the keli does not affect the chayis. Chayis is head to toe, one equal chayis. The only thing is, if there's an injury, God forbid, to a body, then the chayis is affected in its giluyim, but not the etzem chayis. So yeah, that's why that's why I'm elaborating, because it's not just about giluyim, it's also about the atzmi of the nefesh. Its whole role is different. So it's true. If there's an injury, then you could say it just goes back to its natural place, just like a seichel is not expressed itself if there's some form of a block in the keli. So the keli affects the giluyim of it. It doesn't affect the atzmi. And atzmi is the nefesh, and seichel is not an atzmi. So therefore, that's the bottom line. Yeah. Well, you could say also another thing. I think it's very important to mention. Now I realize. No, I think it does apply. Even when there's an injury, God forbid, to the body, the person doesn't become, that part doesn't die. You're still alive. Even when there's a stroke, Rahman al-Islam, it doesn't die. What is the expression of seichel is not there. But if God forbid a part of the body would become what's called the aver meduldal, you'd have to amputate it. If it really dies, in a sense, and it doesn't allow the chayes because it can destroy the rest of the person. So even when there's an injury to the body, the person is still alive. That means the nefesh is there no matter what. The only thing is you don't see the expression. Let's say a person can't use they had an injury to their leg, so they can't use the leg, but the leg is still alive. So there you see there's no shinui. The shinui is only in the use of the leg, but not in the life of the leg. Now, if God forbid the blood or something else long enough is blocked and doesn't flow, that's called when they say gangrene, and then a person ultimately has a part of the body, Rahman al-Islam, that has no life force. They won't let it cannot remain on the body because of its yeah. So I think there's the function and there's actual life. And that's the distinction here. If you're using chayes hanefesh as an example. Okay. Actually, we're sitting here and I'm pontificating and trying to explain it. The Rebbe Rashab is going to explain it more. So let's hope we were mechaven. U'kamoy bezeh, and I was explaining. U'kamoy, like we see. She'etzem ha'nefesh mekusher u'mugdir beguf. U'kamoy bezeh she'etzem ha'nefesh mekusher u'mugdir beguf. Ein shinei klal ben katus v'gadus. Exactly what I just said. That the etzem nefesh, from the moment of conception, or if you want, the moment of birth, the nefesh, God takes the soul. Remember, just let me spell it out. A father, it says there are three shutfim, three partners. The body, the father and mother provide the body, the different parts of the physical entity. The Eibishter provides the neshama. That's why you could have everything working well. God just shows us He's not going to send a neshama, then you don't have a life. So he's saying the etzem skashus. Let me read it again. Etzem hanefesh mekusher mugder beguf becomes bound and contained, mugder, defined by the body. This neshama that was in higher worlds, the Eibishter took a neshama, a ruchnisdik neshama, and put it into a body, and now they've become joined as one, and that's life. That's you and I and every person on earth. Once the neshama becomes mekusher mugder beguf, he says, "Ein shinei klal ben katnus v'gadlus." There's no difference. Once that fundamental connection between body and soul and body does not change when you're younger or older. V'hu b'shava le'elam merega rishena ad rega achrena, and it's equal forever, from the first moment to the last moment. So he's saying not even chayes, he's talking about the mere fact that there's a neshama in a guf. Doesn't matter whether you're asleep, whether you're awake, whether you're at full strength, whether you're older, whether you're younger, whether you've been injured, God forbid. The kesher of neshama beguf is equal from the first moment from birth to death, from the first moment to the last moment of when the neshama and guf are connected with each other. And there's not subject to any change. You don't say that the neshama and the guf are less connected or more connected due to some circumstance. In seichel, you absolutely do. If the keli is weaker or the keli is younger and smaller, the seichel will be directly impacted by that. It won't express itself in the fullest sense of the word. But kesher of neshama and guf is equal throughout. ובשכל יש בה שינויים. On the other hand, intelligence, or the mind, there are changes. זהו מפני שאין עצמוס הנפש. That is due because it's not the core spirit, core soul. Okay, now he's going to continue. V'chein hu, and the same, just as we say about seichel, we say the same thing, b'chol ha'keiches, all the faculties. She'enam atzmius hanefesh. They are not the core soul. Rakelim ulevushim. They're only containers and garments, el hanefesh, for the soul. In other words, forms of expression, forms of conduits. Shanefesh mizgala al yodam upeyelas al yodam. The nefesh is revealed through them and effectuates through them. It impacts things through them. In other words, if a neshama was not inside of a guf, inside of a neshama b'guf, they're not manifest in faculties, it would be there, but it wouldn't have any form of expression. Okay, so now we've established one side of it, that the koiches, which is this whole elaboration, is not etzem hanefesh, but now he's going to go back and say, but nevertheless, they're connected to the nefesh, like we've been learning. U'makol mokim, this is the other side of the coin, when coming back to Atzilus, both sides. U'makol mokim, v'afal pikein, and nevertheless, he makol mokim levushim atzmim lenefesh. Now he's used the word atzmim, not nifrodim. They're not separate force. They're not separate garments. They're part and parcel of vushim atzmim to the nefesh. So in other words, they're not like clothing that you take on and take off. They are connected with, and thus, that's what he calls levushim atzmim, not levushim hanifrodim. Sharihem keches nafshim. Because they're faculties of the spirit, they're spirit faculties. They're not a different personality than the nefesh. All they are is the nefesh expressing itself. They don't define the nefesh because the nefesh is beyond them, but they're also not a muhus achar. They're not like, for example, as I said, you put on a jacket is not part of your body. The keiches are part of the nefesh. Not the whole nefesh, but they're part and expressive of the nefesh. U'kumay machshavu dibur, shein esius, shezeh mahus achar, b'mahus ruchnis hanefesh. When you talk about machshavu dibur, thought and speech are external forces that are different mahus, different personality from the spirit of the nefesh. They're asius, that you're using words, that you're using to express seichel or midas or whatever it may be. Either machshava, words within yourself, or dibur, words outside yourself. In other words, if you didn't have machshava dibur, God forbid, there was no machshava dibur, what would be? The person would be completely intact. The koiches would be intact, but there'd be no expression. So you need to have a garment that's not part of who you are to express in letters and words whatever the idea may be, and whatever the thought, the speech may be. Why can't you say the same thing with the koach HaSeichel and the nefesh? If a person didn't have the koach HaSeichel, because the seichel at the end of the day is not an outside force. Okay. It needs more elaboration. Let's read and I'll explain as we go. Mashenkin seichel and midas, by contrast, seichel, intellect, and emotions and feelings, hariyem keches ruchnim and muhus ruchnis hanefesh. They are ethereal, or you could say spiritual faculties from the same personality as the ruchnis of the nefesh, of the spirit, the etherealness, or of the nefesh, of the spirit of the person. Rak, and goes back again. only qualifying, she'ena mehusa nefesh atzmei. They're not the mehusa nefesh atzmei, but they're made of the same material, so to speak. She'en rak levushim, because they're only garments and expressions of the nefesh. And nevertheless, they are unified garments with the nefesh. It continues. So we're going to finish the point and then we'll see what we need to explain. They're going to give example now with the body itself, like he did before already. Ukamoy, haguf. Like the physical body itself. Shurak levush. The body is not the soul. It's only a garment for the soul, where the soul encloses itself in the guf. Ukamoy eire basar talbisheni. When we say the expression talbisheni, dress me, he dressed me with flesh, or skin, and basar, and flesh. So in other words, the neshama on its own does not have eir and basar, skin and flesh, and then the Eibishter dresses the neshama up in the garment called the physical body. And nevertheless, the body is not a removable garment. It's a garment and a levush to the nefesh, but it's miyuchad with the nefesh. Once a body and soul join, you can't just say, okay, every night I'm going to take off my body and hang it up in a closet. It doesn't work that way. They become and join as one. Miyuchad im nefesh, acha nefesh mispal b'mikrei haguf. To the point that Chassidus brings that the nefesh itself is affected by and impacted by the events that happen with the body. In other words, if a body feels pain, Chassidus brings that a nefesh also feels pain. It's not oblivious. So both ways, the nefesh is mislabish in the guf, and they become join as one, where you cannot say, there's no part of my body where you could say which part of the body is nefesh, which is guf. They've joined as one. It's completely fused together. My jacket I can take off. The body and soul are fused together, and yet the body is not the soul. It's still a garment, but a garment that's been attached to it. And to the point that the nefesh itself, now you could say, goes only one way. The guf is connected with the nefesh, but the nefesh feel the body? It says yes. The nefesh feels what the body experiences. So clearly you see there, it's not, my jacket does not feel what I experience. It's an independent, like he said, a dover mahus acher. I just want to, let me just see something, 1 second. Let me finish, and then I want to say something I think important here. So that's an example. Just like the physical body is not the nefesh, but it joins as one. The keiches are not the nefesh, etzem nefesh, but they join as one with the nefesh. And I was going to say one more point that makes it even stronger. And that emergence or the existence of faculties that come from the nefesh, like intelligence that comes from our souls, from our spirits, it's a new thing. It's something new. The nefesh, in other words, on its own, is not about seichel. Even though he called it nefesh HaMaskil, that's after you have seichel, it's one, and expresses itself that way. But the actual faculty is a chiddush, just like the guf is a chiddush to the neshama. It's a chiddush that becomes one with it, but it's a new novel reality. Because higher than the level of intelligence, intellect, which the nefesh is, there is no existence of seichel. Oh wow, okay. So now he's adding another point. Not only is the nefesh beyond seichel, and seichel is a chiddush, He says, because that's the case, because it's higher than seichel, that even the Koach HaMaskil, the power of the nefesh to conceive ideas, you don't feel it. We don't feel the power to conceive ideas. We know it's coming from there. When you become conscious of an idea that you've conceived, you're aware, now I'm conscious of an idea. But if I were to ask you, can you define where ideas come from? You'll say, I don't know. We just told that in the nefesh, there's a thing called a Koach HaMaskil. One of its capacities is to conceive, but we don't feel it, he says, Eina Margish, because it's not in a state of Mitzias Sichli. There's no tangible idea there yet. It's like a generator of ideas, but not an idea because it's on a nefesh level. So we see from this that seichel is like an additional element that the nefesh itself is higher than, and it's a form of a chiddush. And when it's on the nefesh level, it's not the same reality. It's more of a nefesh reality than a seichel reality. V'hainu, sha'seichel kishim is gala.
Is part of the nefesh.
What?
Koach HaMaskil is part
the
of
nefesh. The nefesh has a koach hamaskil, like it has a koach hachesed. But on that level, it's only a koach in the nefesh. It's not a actual faculty. It's not, Koach HaMaskil is not yet seichel goli. I'm going to explain it more. I want to read till the end of the paragraph, and then I will explain the whole thing more, okay? V'hainu, sha'seichel k'shem izgala, a seichel when it gets revealed, v'nimtze mekoach hamaskil, and it emerges from the power of intellect, the power of conceiving, eina margish es mikere. It does not feel its source. When we are become conscious, at that moment you feel it, but you don't feel where it came from. You don't only know it came from somewhere. It's like it came from an invisible reality. Because seichel comes in the form of ischachus. It's something new and novel. It's not like water coming from a faucet. It's seichel coming from a thing that is beyond seichel, called Koach HaMaskil. It comes into an existing conscious idea or sichli intellect. And the power to conceive ideas is not an existing seichel. It's not a pot of water that you're drawing a cup from. It's a different reality. It's a nafshizdik reality, and therefore there's a chiddush going on here, as seichel becomes a tangible and concrete conscious reality. So it's not like you have a bunch of ideas locked up in your closet of your brain, and then you turn on the faucet and ideas start flowing. No, the place it's locked up in, so to speak, is a potential state. It's not an actual seichel state. It's designated from the nefesh to manifest in seichel, but it itself is not a seichel. We've talked about this earlier at length. The Rebbe, especially the Friedrich Rebbe and Sadik Daled, spoke at length between the nefesh, the Koach HaMaskil, and the seichel alone, which I'm going to elaborate on in a minute. I just want to finish till the end here to get the whole picture. Okay. Umakom mokim, and again the other side of the coin. And nevertheless, ein ze bechinas ischachus mamish. It's ischachus to one end, because it's become a defined entity, but it's not mamish ischachus. It's not completely new. Shari margish makom mokim, because you still feel at the end of the day, you still feel shenimshach me'ezeh moker. You feel it came from somewhere. You just don't know where it came from, and you can't identify that state of being, but you sense that it came from somewhere, from some source. It's not like yesh ma'ayin, where you can't even identify that it came from a source. Yesh ma'ayin, the yesh doesn't even feel it came from anywhere. I'm here, and that's it. No yesh feels, oh, I must have a source. It's yusim atzmuse, as we learned. En le'il v'sibah. Shayesh ein margish klal sheyesh moker hamahava eseh. The yesh does not feel at all that there's a source that created it. Like we learned earlier, the Anochi, the Maimer, I think it was the last Maimer maybe. No, yeah, the Maimer before this one, yeah. It was a long time ago because we learned Tzadik Dalet and much material before. Okay. Because that's the other side of the coin. Because as much as it's not the nefesh, it's also not separate from the nefesh. Totally separate. Shu koyach nafshi, because it's a koyach of the nefesh. U'makol mokim, and then another makol mokim. Hu chutz la'atzmos ha-nefesh. And yet, it's chutz from the etzem of the nefesh. It's an expression outside of the atzmos ha-nefesh. U'bo b'bchinas ischachos. And comes in a form of something new that emerged. Now, I know when you read this, it sounds, which one is it? How many times did he say U'makol mokim here in the last 7 lines? I count 5 times he said it, at least.
It's a levush atzmi.
It's like Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
Okay.
That's why it's a levush, but it's a levush atzmi.
Okay. Does everybody understand this clearly? Then I don't need to explain it, but I'll explain it to myself, and you can listen in, okay? I think it's vital to state the following. It's vital to state the reason this is hard to understand, really in a tangible way, is because we exist in creatures. We do not understand atz etzem. We live in a world of expression. We work from the bottom up. We don't start with an etzem and say, now the etzem is now going to manifest in dargis, in a level, another level. We start the other way around. I am me. I'm Simon Jacobson. You're Eliezer Gold. You're Shlomo Tachtel. Tzvi Lang. Yecheskel Yar. I might as well mention everybody. Naftali Greenwald, whoever else is on. I don't know everybody that's on the program. You start with your identity. You're aware of your identity. You're aware of your family. You're aware of the world around you, wherever you live. You know your feelings. You know your experiences. You know what you need to do today. Then begins a journey. Is this all who I am? Is there more to me than the sum of the parts of my life? And you'll see where I'm going in a moment. It's very, I think, vital to state this. So when we hear these atheists, it's in a way, and I say it also for myself, as much as you learn it, it defies in a certain way the way we think. We don't think this way. We don't think about an etzem that's beyond everything, and then it starts manifesting in some type of structure, and more structure, and more structure, more structure, and here we are. We think from the bottom up. I exist, and now I want to figure out what my existence is like. Why do I exist? Who put me here? What's my purpose? And you slowly start climbing and realizing, oh, you know what? There's much more to me than what I think it was. That's why I believe that when you read this, not to say we don't get it. I think there's a certain element we get because we've learned this on many times. But I think it's important to qualify. We don't think in terms etzem, bilti mishtana, that's not subject to change, not subject to structure, and then comes structure. We go from structure to etzem. And that's why it's harder to relate to. You know, I have seichel, you have seichel. So you say, okay, where's my mind, where intelligence come from? Okay, you tell me Koach HaMaskil, fine. It comes from a power in the nefesh that has the power to conceive. But that is for us something unique because we relate to the seichel. Tell me seichel, okay, 2 + 2 = 4. Now you tell me it comes from some deeper place. What does that place look like? We don't really have a handle on it. We know it comes from somewhere. Then you tell me the Koach HaMaskil itself is also not the highest point. That comes from the nefesh. The nefesh has a Koach HaMaskil, like it has a Koach Chesed. And then there comes the actual expression of it. But when you really think about it, the truth is everything starts from the top. Atzmus Muhus, and I'm talking about Atzmus. Everything we've learned. Yesh Amiti. Yesh Amiti has no giluyim, has no structure, has no change, has nothing. It's not defined by anything. That alone is already difficult for us to relate to because everything has definition. Even if when I say no definition, we also say that also is a definition. No definition. So then we're told you can't even define him by no definition. You have to say that he's not defined, he's not defined, he's not defined, and that none. I apologize. that non-existence, so to speak, built in Metzias Nimtza, because he's not limited by anything, chose to create structure. Let's just call it that, to create existence, to create Metzias Nimtza. Something should, when you say exists, it's here, it exists. You can't say an Atzmus, it's here. You just don't speak that language. It's a reality because it's reality. It doesn't have to be defined. It doesn't have to be recognized by us, and it doesn't have to be proven. It's etzem, amitis amitzias, as he called it, and so on. And then he added and expressed himself. I'm going to express myself through Oyer. Oyer is still shapeless. It's poshet betachlis apshitus, but it's now an expression. Some we called it the field of energy. Some Ayin, highest levels, it doesn't have any identity. It doesn't have any personality. All it is Atzmus choosing to create, I don't want to say space, to create a field of energy in which he's going to create an existence like ours, where things are defined and structured, but there's no definition yet. You don't even say Svirus Saint Ketz. You don't even say Rotzen. In Samach Vav Vayelech, and here also he's Rotzen, it's also is already a desire for something. Even the word desire is not used. And then you move down. I don't mean physically down. Then a desire arises and still very amorphous. Then come more details and more and more and more. As you move along till the Tzimtzum, which radically shifts everything, because now you're actually creating something. So if you think about it, everything is Ischachus compared to Atzmos. But Oyer is not such a mechudish as Yesh, for example, because Oyer at least is completely focused on and devoted to its source. So though it's a chiddush because Atzmos doesn't need Oyer, and Oyer is as infinitely distant from Atzmos than anything is, but as we've learned, Oyer, from its perspective, it has nothing but Atzmos. It's completely dedicated to Atzmos. It's complete bittul. So the chiddush is that it's not needed. The chiddush is Atzmos is not defined by Oyer. But Oyer, you can say, is an expression of Elokus. On a much, much lower level, Atzilus is exactly that. We're going to learn that in the next paragraph. Atzilus is also that. It's a structure, but it's a godly structure. So on one hand, it tells you what Elokus wants. On the other hand, it's definitely a defined state. Going back to Koach HaNefesh now, we have an example for this within ourselves. If you go from the bottom up, you start with a very revealed faculty. I'm moving my hands. I'm using my seichel. I'm using my midas. But if you go from the top down, it starts like it is in Elokus. Etzem HaNefesh. God created a soul. What is it defined by? A divine force that will become a neshama. You could say Vayipar Ba'apav Nishmas Chaim, God infused it with a personality of a divine element to it, etc., etc. B'tzalmenu K'dmusenu, however you interpret it. Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish. I'm not talking now Nefesh Elikis. I mean here the etzemini that God chose to create a soul. Now that He wants the soul, just like He Himself is going to manifest and create Eser Sfiris, Nishtal Shalom Ahen, that He wants the soul to have Eser Sfiris, Eser Koachos. So the Eser Koachos is at the soul? No. But is it outside of the soul? No, because it's an expression of the soul. So on one hand, it's a chidush because it's not the soul. On the other hand, you can't call it ischachus mamish because all it is an expression of the soul, just like the 10 spheres of Atzilus are an expression of Elokus. Chesed of Atzilus, it doesn't have any other agenda except expressing God's chesed. So is it Elokus or is it chesed? And as such, the answer is, it has both elements to it. So when you think that way, it makes it easier to digest this. Because when you read it, it starts the whole thing. Is it the koachos? Is it nefesh? Is it not nefesh? So the nefesh is l'mayla mishinuyim. The seichel or the other koachos are subject to change. Therefore, eris and kalim affect each other like he explained. And the goof is a good example because the physical body, on one hand, is a chidush. The soul doesn't need a body. But once it joins the body is a naturally fused, a misachid, as being a keli atzmi for the nefesh. And if you take a stone, a nefesh ha'adam cannot go into a stone. That's a gilgul, which causes tremendous pain to the nefesh. You know why? Because the stone is not conducive to becoming a levush atzmi to the body. If you took a nefesh ha'adam and put it into a stone, the stone would not become suddenly an active human being. So you see from that the guf on one hand is not the nefesh, but it's also very much tailored and joins the nefesh in the life that we live, where they both travel together as one. That is somewhat a little more broadening, make it a little easier to relate to. I hope that was helpful. It was helpful to me at least. So thank you for listening. So we're going to stop here at the bottom of page, the last paragraph here, at the end of, closer to the bottom of 1165. And yeah, but if anybody,